Great. Well, hey, y'all. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the Staking on Stacks L2, a new era for Bitcoin webinar. My name is Drake Breeding. I am Protocol Opportunities Lead here at Figment. Figment's a leading provider of digital asset infrastructure. Specifically, we run staking infrastructure and validators on about 40 different blockchain networks. If you have any questions throughout the course of the webinar, feel free to ask the chat or in the Q&A. Want to get to as many questions from folks as we can, so we'll be answering some throughout the course of the conversation, and then we'll have some dedicated time at the end as well for anything that's a little longer. I'm joined today by three panelists, and I will pass the mic over to each of them for an intro. Muneeb, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, happy to. I'm Muneeb. I'm the co-founder of Stacks, which is a Bitcoin L2. And these days I focus on Trust Machines, which is a company that is building Bitcoin applications. And we obviously use Stacks and also Bitcoin L1 for building some of these applications.
Awesome. Muneeb did not say Bitcoin OG in his description, but he certainly is. Kyle, how about you? What's your background, sir?
Hi, everybody. I'm Kyle Ellicott. I lead investor relations throughout the Stacks ecosystem and also an advising partner to Bitcoin Frontier Fund, which originated as the ecosystem fund for companies building on Stacks and today focuses on not just the Stacks blockchain, but also companies building on Bitcoin in general.
Awesome. And finally, Andy Cronk.
Yeah, thanks, Drake. So my name's Andy. I'm one of the co-founders of Figment. We have a long-running joke. We've been always focused on one thing, which is staking. And so whenever we talk about our company, we say, we do everything except Bitcoin. Well, I don't get to say that anymore. The world's changing. And so I'm excited to talk more about that today.
Awesome. Great point. Well, thank you guys all for joining. And yeah, let's jump right in. Muneeb, we'll keep this one super brief. Instead of giving us the whole overview of Stacks, I think everybody here probably has at least a little bit of familiarity with it. Three questions for you. What is Stacks? What is stacking? And why should I care about it now?
So I think the simplest way to think of Stacks is it's a Bitcoin L2. And the goal of the Stacks project is to sort of like build the best Bitcoin L2 out there. You should be able to move your BTC from L1 into the L2. And over there, it's programmable, it's cheaper, it's faster. And that's how we think Bitcoin is going to scale. Like this is how Bitcoin goes to like 1 billion people. Like in terms of stacking, so STX is the asset at the L2 layer that people use to secure the L2 network, right? So if you want to play a role in it, if you want to be a validator, a signer, you take STX, especially after this major upgrade that is happening on the network, and you lock it. So now you're sort of like performing work for the network. And as a reward for that, as almost like payment for that work, you earn BTC, which is a very, very unique thing. I don't think there's any other asset in the crypto industry where by holding or locking it and doing work for the network, you can actually earn BTC. And this BTC is on the L1. So people are very pleasantly surprised when Bitcoin shows up in their L1 wallet. And that's stacking. People who are familiar with staking, like it's sort of similar but different, right? Like you're earning BTC and the work that you're doing is also slightly different.
Awesome. That's great. And yeah, I think anytime extra crypto shows up in your wallet, particularly Bitcoin, it's pretty exciting. Andy, I'm gonna hand it over to you for a second. You know, founder of a staking company, where we all hear about proof of stake, staking on Ethereum, staking on Solana. What are some of your kind of initial questions for Stacks and its unique sort of mechanism for staking?
Yeah, and if I could try to channel what I've learned doing this for the past 6 years, is when there's a new opportunity for staking, the people who hold the token, we see them as customers, you probably view them as token holders, your community. They have two questions. It's, should I stake this? Like, what's the opportunity? What's the risk in staking? How does it work is really what they're asking. And then the second question, which I like to answer is, why should they choose Figment? I'm not going to do that commercial today. But really, I think it'd be really useful to hear from you, Kyle, or Muneeb, just at the high level. Who are the players in this game? Because it sounds like there's miners, there's signers. It's different. and it sounds like this importantly different because you can earn BTC. And so can you kind of go one level deeper on, if you want to talk about proof of transfer, or just start with the players, who's involved here and who does what?
Yeah, I can take a shot, and Kyle, feel free to add anything here. So I would say that this network is different from your typical proof of stake network, and maybe first it's important to like try and understand why, right? So if you're building a separate network from Bitcoin, like Ethereum or Solana, it's a disconnected, independent ecosystem, right? So you have a new native asset, and you're basically staking it and being a validator to kind of like, you know, run that network. With Stacks, being a Bitcoin L2, our sort of like goals are different, right? Like we want to build something on top of Bitcoin. We want to reuse Bitcoin security and sort of like secure the L2 by Bitcoin, right? Instead of building something like independent. So that's where proof of transfer comes in. Like it's a little bit like, you know, Bitcoin is like digital energy. Can we reuse this energy to secure an L2? Right. So that's the work that the miners are doing. So miners operate at the L1 level, and they are sort of, you know, proposing the new blocks. They're in some ways, if people are familiar with sequencers for L2s on Ethereum, miners are more similar to sequencers, especially after the next upgrade on the network. So they sequence the blocks. They're the ones who are bidding in BTC. So they're actually, you know, they're the ones sending these BTC rewards that show up in your wallets if you're actively stacking. And they're performing work for the network, and they have their own incentives to sort of like do it. And then at the L2 layer, one work that you are doing is similar to Ethereum and Solana, which is validating the blocks, right? So the sequencers propose a block, you validate it, you sort of like sign off on it that this block is correct. But there's also another additional work that you're doing, which is also important, which is, again, for Solana and Ethereum, they're independent system, they have their own crypto assets. Over here, our entire purpose is to make BTC programmable. So there's movement of BTC from the L1 into the L2, which is completely, you know, decentralized because the L2 understands that there is an L1, right? So your Bitcoin can easily move to the L2. But when you are moving it back from the L2 to the L1, Bitcoin is old technology, and it doesn't know that there is an L2 running on top of it, right? So these validators also do the job of kind of like processing the withdrawals, and making sure that, you know, you can get your Bitcoin out of the L2 back into the L.
That makes sense. And so miners and signers are those sort of the two top level roles. Do you imagine that there will be actual there's people who are Bitcoin miners today? Do you imagine they'll be the ones who are participating as a miner? Is it an opportunity for me if I have Bitcoin in my wallet? Can I be a miner? What kind of a person or entity do you see playing that mining role?
Kyle, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so I think Muneeb added a few of those characteristics already into the list, but in addition, anybody. We've got in the current version of the network right now, we do have stacking cycles that run just over 2 weeks at a time, that any Stacks holder, any STX holder can actually participate in the stacking process as well. So they can help, they can support the network, can contribute, whether they're a miner, whether they're an individual, whether they're an investor, it doesn't matter. They can participate as long as they're holding STX, the native Stacks token as well, which is pretty exciting for, again, the reasons Muneeb already mentioned, because as you stack, you support the network, but you also then yield back BTC or Bitcoin back into your wallet. And also, as things have recently progressed here at the beginning of the year, you can stack to participate in the ecosystem and some of the applications that live on the ecosystem, thanks to liquid stacking, and something new that we've just had introduced into the ecosystem as well. And so, yeah, you've got everyone from miners to individuals to investors, whether it's VCs, private equity, or the like, that are all contributing along with the everyday average person as well.
Yeah, and
Cool.
in terms
So-
of sort of like the Bitcoin miners, so I've personally seen some interest, like people who are running Bitcoin mining networks, they get sort of like naturally interested that if there's an L2 that's getting a lot of traction, they already run mining infrastructure. they're like, hey, how can we mine sort of the L2 as well? And then they are sort of like, pleasantly surprised that it actually doesn't cost any more hardware. There aren't like, like heavy hardware requirements like ASIC mining that you have to do on the Bitcoin L1. So in some ways, it's very lightweight. Like anyone that has access to Bitcoin really and can run a node can be a miner.
Okay, so is the right way to think about this? Because I'm hearing two different games to play, two different opportunities for people. For some people, if they have Bitcoin, they can do this auction process and earn STX on the other side. And then if you have STX, you can stack it and earn Bitcoin. Is this kind of the two different flows that are available?
Yeah, I think that's correct. And
Yeah.
I would say the profile for these two participants is a little bit different, right? So the type of people who are into mining, they're typically optimizing the mining process. And it's all about your profitability, right? Like, can you have a better mining strategy than the other players, right? So these people are, I would say, typically much more sophisticated. They might have, a background in game theory or like optimizing sort of like, DeFi opportunities and so on. Whereas I think the type of individual that participates in on the network on the stacking side might be more broad, right? Like these are your token holders who are interested in earning a yield. And I think this is where companies like Figment come in, where maybe you don't have the technical expertise of running a node, making sure it's reliable and so on, but you do want to participate. You're a believer in the project, you're a token holder. And I think then you can delegate out that task of running the nodes to companies like Figment. And I think that's and some people might be technical enough to do it themselves, right? But it's not for everybody for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think mapping out some of the participants there is good for folks to understand it a little bit better. Proof of transfer, really cool consensus mechanism, takes some inspiration from staking, from proof of work, from proof of burn, all into this really cool novel method that ultimately pays out Bitcoin and yield, which is super unique. Muneeb, you mentioned upgrade to stacks coming. Stacks, the original concept's been around for a little bit, right? You go through some old documentation, you'll still see a block stack here and there sometimes. Talk to us a little bit about how the idea for the Nakamoto upgrade was conceived and kind of how you see it playing out and affecting the Stacks ecosystem.
Yeah, so I think the mainnet launch of Stacks happened in early 2021. And I think people have to understand that the network was sort of like built by developers who are very sort of like deep on the Bitcoin side of things, right? And typically, decentralization matters a lot to us. Security of the network matters a lot to us. And I think the first version of the network, which you can think of as almost like the legacy system that's running now, about to be upgraded, which is by far like the biggest upgrade, right? It feels it's actually like almost like a mainnet launch than anything else. It's a massive upgrade, like 100x, improvement in speed and some of the other things. So the lessons that we learned were actually from real world data. Like we saw applications come in, devs come in, users come in, and with our sort of like focus on decentralization, the Stacks node could even run on Raspberry Pis, right? So and they can run anywhere in the world and sort of like participate. You don't have to run them in like data centers with high network bandwidth and so on, which is like really good for decentralization, like Bitcoin, right? But at the same time, the typical experience that users were having were running more high-powered networks like Solana, which are really fast. They're much more high powered. They're running in data centers. They have much more, high bandwidth. And I think it turned out to be almost like a UX challenge. And that challenge also comes from the fact that, for network security, all of the transactions on Stacks were getting settled on Bitcoin. But that means that, a Stacks block happens when a Bitcoin block happens, which is between 10 to 40 minutes on average. So again, I think it's a downside on the UX. And so that was the first lesson that, we have to improve the UX for the users if you want Bitcoin to be the asset and Bitcoin to be more mainstream, instead of like, some of these other networks that were getting a lot of these users. People were using NFTs and DeFi on the other networks versus doing that on Bitcoin or Bitcoin L2s. So I think that was a big challenge, and we were sort of like able to solve it in the Nakamoto release, where we are able to keep the security benefits. In fact, the security of the network has actually gone up a lot. Now you can get Bitcoin finality like very quickly as soon as a Bitcoin sort of like block arrives. And now Stacks actually has 100% of Bitcoin hash power securing it, which is again like a huge improvement. But now people can also have fast, cheap transactions in between Bitcoin blocks, right? So let's say you do a transaction on the L2. Let's say I'm doing a BTC payment on the L2 and Kyle is doing a BTC payment on the L1. What our experience would look like is on the L2, within, let's say, 5 seconds, you get a confirmation. And this confirmation is now coming from all the people who have staked capital on the L2. So let's say roughly $1.2 billion is locked today. That's a pretty strong security guarantee, right? That this $1.2 billion is sort of like, ran consensus and signed off that your transaction is included and the BTC payment went through. But then as soon as a Bitcoin block arrives, the security guarantee is now Bitcoin hash power, even on the L2, right? So Kyle was in a way sort of like waiting in the Bitcoin mempool, didn't get a confirmation, right? And probably paid a much higher fee to get the transaction in. But on the L2, it was cheaper, it was faster. And once the Bitcoin block came, like actually at the security level, I would argue that they're similar. To reverse that transaction, someone will now have to reorg a Bitcoin L1 block. So I think that's a massive sort of like an upgrade. Same thing with network capacity. I think we learned the lesson that these networks would probably get a lot more traffic than the type of traffic on the L1. L1 mostly does, Bitcoin transfers. Over here, people are doing all sorts of things. They're running different applications. So you need much more network capacity. And I think that's something that Nakamoto upgrade is also providing. And let me pause there. There are a few other important things as well.
Yeah, I think it's so exciting to see how you're iterating. And this is about staking, so I have to ask the staking question, which is we get asked a lot. What's the rewards rate? What's the staking rewards rate? We use the acronym SRR, or the abbreviation SRR. And so what I'm hearing from you is you're planning for a lot more activity. And so what makes up the BTC rewards? What are the components of it? It sounds like there's maybe a fixed supply of STX. Maybe that comes into it. Like, can you walk me through will the rewards rate fluctuate up and down based on activity? Is there opportunities for MEV that we've seen in Ethereum? Just what are the components of the staking rewards rate, and what would cause it to go up or down?
Yeah, so I think I'll divide that into two parts. The first is, as you mentioned, there is a base protocol yield. So STX has like a predetermined supply every year, and I think those new STX coming out, this is what the miners are bidding on, right? So it's like 1,000 STX per block right now, and I think that you can think of that as the base yield, because for the people who are participating in stacking, for them it comes out as BTC, right? And that over there, it fluctuates a little bit, but the variable there is how many people are participating. So if suddenly, a lot of people start participating, then, everyone's getting a smaller slice of that yield. So the yield might go down. We've seen like on average over the last 2 years, like anywhere between 300 million to 400 million STX participates on the network. And that translates to a 5 to 6% yield, which is what we have seen historically, and which is great, by the way. Like for getting like a 5-6% in BTC is actually really good, and people enjoy it. It's a very sticky thing as well. We've seen even during the bear market, people were very dedicated to this and sort of like participated every cycle and so on. And then I think the more interesting thing is actually as especially after this network upgrade, as more app activity happens, more users come. There's a very interesting economic dynamic that as more people are using the network, the BTC yield actually goes up, right? So now on top of the 5-6%, whatever gas fees are being generated, they are also being paid as BTC to these people, right? So that's a very positive sort of like economic reinforcement cycle. that if you're a believer in the network, you're doing work for it, and you want to see it grow, as the network is going to grow and get more users, your BTC yield goes up.
That makes sense. So let me see if I can play it back for you. Right now there's some schedule that says how many STX are available per block. The miners bid on that. So my first question is, what determines the STX per block? Is it some preset emission schedule? What's that based on? And did I remember correctly that STX is a fixed supply and there's sort of halving similar to Bitcoin, then the amount per block goes down? Like, what's the dynamics there?
Yes. So I think I would consider it like not a fixed supply asset like Bitcoin. It's not that there would only ever be 21 million, right? Like that sort of a thing, but it has a predetermined supply. So people know that, let's say by year 2050, what's the emission curve? But the emission curve doesn't stop at year 2050, right? There is a per year sort of like minimal tail end release that's there even after year 2050. But right now, I think most people just care about the year 2050 supply. So whenever you see this number of like, it's 18 million, right? So 1.8 something billion STX, that's actually the year 2050 supply. And then the circulating supply is a little lower. Around 70% or so is already in circulation, which again, I think is a very interesting thing about the network. That given it was launched with the SEC qualified offering, everything's very transparent and everything's liquid as well, right? So there are some networks where only 10% of the token or 20% of the token are liquid. There's a lot of unlocking and emissions that are about to happen. If you look at Stacks, like everything's liquid, right? The only new tokens that are being released are through mining, which is again a preset schedule. It has been running for years, so people actually know how much impact of that new issuance happens. So there's a lot of like real data and sort of like a very transparent supply of the asset.
Awesome. Talking a little bit about how this all works post Nakamoto and increase in rewards from increased gas usage, that kind of thing. What kind of new applications do you think are going to be possible with Nakamoto, and what are some of the things that people are building in the Stacks ecosystem right now? I know we saw like Zest protocol as an example, DeFi app raise around recently. Have a handful of apps I'm aware of, but yeah, what's exciting you in kind of the Stacks community right now? That's for both of you guys.
I'll go ahead and kick it off. I've had the lucky advantage, I guess, of watching a lot of these projects initially launch back when mainnet happened in 2021, and we saw a ton of ideas and all the categories launch that time. Everything from gaming to NFTs to DeFi to so many other applications, including core infrastructure. Fast forward as things are beginning here in 2024, but as we look at the second half post Nakamoto, we are going to see some of the resurgence of a lot of that. And one of the biggest categories that we're seeing a lot of excitement in is Bitcoin DeFi. There's also some strong interest around Bitcoin-backed stablecoins to then staking and some native Bitcoin yields as well around that, just because the capabilities that Nakamoto releases, but also another part of Nakamoto is SBTC. And SBTC being the asset that it is will allow in simply Bitcoin to be able to move from the L1 to the L2. Once you do that and unlock Bitcoin liquidity, that $1.5 trillion of Bitcoin that we see being held across the world all of a sudden becomes movable and usable in some capacity. And a lot of entrepreneurs right now within the Stacks ecosystem are thinking about how can they take advantage of this in terms of the applications they're building to provide new use cases, again, whether it be around staking or yielding, lending, borrowing, and many other areas around DeFi. Also starting to get early excitements around gaming again, and tying in something around ordinals, which is a whole nother conversation, in inscriptions, but then also real world assets is now becoming an interesting topic as well. So Bitcoin DeFi is the biggest unlock right now.
Awesome. We just had a question in from the audience, kind of speaking of real world assets. We hear Bitcoin described as a digital gold frequently. So given the challenges Bitcoin faces with decreasing block rewards and the potential for reduced transaction volume due to its digital gold narrative, what do you see as the most viable solutions for ensuring its long-term network sustainability and security? How likely are these solutions to be implemented? I know that's a broad one, but
yeah, no, I think this question was, I would say, extremely valid and maybe a concern like a year ago, even maybe a year and a half ago. And at that time, it was almost like, Bitcoin has an 8-9 year runway where the Coinbase or the base rewards are high enough that even without, transaction or high transaction fees, the network can sort of like sustain itself and the security budget. But at some point, in the halving cycles, even though halving cycles will continue on for a long time, I think even at very high prices of Bitcoin, like even if you model Bitcoin at $1 million, at some point, the amount of BTC is so small that the network security sort of like becomes questionable. And I think there are some Bitcoiners who would basically be like, no, it's never going to happen. Well, no, just look at the math. Like you can put a price of Bitcoin and just look at how much Bitcoin is being released, and the total value being released in dollar terms would be much less than what it is today, right? So I do think the positive signs, and the answer really is more network usage, right? You want more people to transact. You want Bitcoin block space to be a competitive environment where people are like trying to bid higher for using it. And I think all sorts of applications like ordinals, runes, and L2s like stacks, they help with this. And I think it's one thing to say like theoretically that these apps would come and help, and a very different thing to actually point out real world data that we have now, that even last year there have been blocks where the gas fees or transaction fees were actually higher than the block reward. And that's a very positive sign that even within a year, which is again, Bitcoin developer ecosystem is at a very early stage right now. Like, devs are just getting started. I know so many L2s are launching, but very few are live right now. Even Stacks is in the middle of the Nakamoto upgrade. So with more L2s launching, more activity on ordinals, other types of new protocols, I think this becomes less and less of an issue because the majority of the incentives will actually come from like gas fees and not the Coinbase rewards.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. Speaking of the halving, we just had one recently. On April 19th, right? Bitcoin had its fourth halving. Rewards are now dropping from 6.25 to 3.125 per block, I believe. How does this compare to previous halvings with just more awareness about crypto, about Bitcoin? Are there things that you were expecting to see, like kind of expectations versus reality pre and post halving? And how are just people and investors thinking about this as a whole?
Yeah.
Go
ahead, Kyle.
No, go ahead, because there's a thing we've talked a lot about. I'll go ahead and say it. I mean, I think coming in to this particular halving, there was a ton of excitement, a ton of hype, and a ton of enthusiasm. Looking forward to just one moment on one day. And there was also a lot of momentum that was building up to this halving, unlike those previous before it. We had the launch of almost a dozen Bitcoin ETFs earlier in the year. We had a ton of new applications. To Muneeb's point, we had what once was 4 L2s, or the core 4, Stacks, Liquid, Lightning, Rootstock, to now almost 80 plus different L2s that announced or have early launches in their testnets and early mainnets, along with a lot of releases on that same day. There was a ton of euphoria leading into it, and then after the fact, I think a lot of people were let down or felt that not much happened, and it just continued on by. However, when you take that aside, on the other end of this, there's actually a ton more enthusiasm when it comes to building, when it comes to developers, when it comes to new projects, new infrastructure, new applications, and the potential going forward. But in summary, this halving was very different than those before it. We had institutional capital coming in waves with billion-dollar inflows every week, week upon week on the ETF side. We had the early announcements of a potential ETF around Ethereum, also Bitcoin ETFs in Asia. We also saw, again, 80 new L2s, announce new technologies, new infrastructure, all coming in along with upgrades. Runes launched on the same day. Nakamoto kicked off its beginning installation phase just moments or just days before it as well. So a lot of excitement going in. And then I think people were expecting a little bit more than just the next day to come. But investors are still very excited and continue to look forward to it.
Like on the sort of like, cooling off after the halving, that is something that I've seen multiple times before, right? Like there's always this sort of like excitement before the halving, and then the months after, like 2-3 months typically, are a little bit of a, sideline period, and people are maybe overexcited, and then the economic dynamics of the halving kick in, and I think things sort of like start picking up. The one thing that was different is that Bitcoin did sort of like reach a new all-time high before the halving, but typically that doesn't happen. So I think something is obviously different going on in the market with the ETFs and all.
There's 2 questions from the audience that are related, and you mentioned all the recent activity. One says, how does Stacks differ from something like Babylon? And then one's more generic. How should we think about Stacks versus other BTC L2s? So if I could synthesize both those and just sort of say, there's a lot of activity in the space. You were early, and how do you plan to differentiate? When should I think about Stacks, and what space, what position you want to occupy in the market?
Yeah, so I think maybe I'll answer the second one first because it's more generic, and then maybe get into Babylon. First of all, before even getting into the comparison, like I think it's amazing to see all sorts of different designs being explored. I think that's exactly what's needed to kick off the Bitcoin L2 category, which is just going to be so good for Bitcoin and BTC and building on Bitcoin. Then I think the next point would be that people are going to experiment with different types of bridge designs, and they are going to experiment with different type of consensus algorithms. And the third dimension is, your programming languages and the VM that you're using. And I would say that on the bridge designs, the fundamental limitation is really Bitcoin capabilities. Like if you don't get more opcodes in Bitcoin, there's only a certain type of bridges you can have. And I think Stacks sort of like already sits on the cutting edge of it. There are some newer projects like BitVM that can enable more secure bridges, like theoretically more secure bridges, even without changing Bitcoin. And we are already sort of like, doing R&D on it, but it remains in the R&D phase for a while to come, at least a year, 18 months or more. So I would say on the bridge inside Stacks is already the state of the art. It has a very decentralized set of signers already. So I think it's a big project. Already 20 plus institutions have said we'll be signers, maybe more will come. So I think a lot of the reputation and quality of the bridge will actually come from these institutions and signers and large capital base as well. Already, north of $1 billion willing to be sort of like stake behind the bridge. So I think that it stands out that way. The second thing on consensus, and different people are experimenting with rollups and a couple of other things. I think our focus is actually on the UX. We want really fast consensus at the L2 layer, and we have actually learned the hard way that this is the thing that actually matters to both developers and users, right? So I think people will experiment with different things over there. Our sort of like focus is pretty clear that we want great UX for users and while maintaining security. The third thing is probably where I think the differentiation is the most clear, and which is that almost every L2, I think 100% of the new L2s are EVM based. Stacks is not EVM based. If anything, it's going towards WASM. I think WASM is getting launched after Nakamoto, and it's pretty further along. People can actually play around with it even right now. And I think that the way to think about this is there were a lot of EVM clones even in the L1 space. And if you look at where a lot of developers are going, they're actually going towards ecosystems like Solana or Near and other places, which sort of like attract like high quality developers, and they are more custom stacks. Like Solana has Rust, Near has WASM with Rust and some other languages as well. I think that's where Stack sort of like differentiates. Like it has like deeply technical devs as core devs. It has this stack that like stands out as different, and we are sort of like like sticking our head a little bit, like, hey, we're not going to be EVM, right? Like if you want EVM, there are tons of options. You can go and play around there, but maybe we attract a certain different type of devs, like maybe similar to Solana, that they were able to do.
One question I have to kind of there's a question about Babylon, I think of it sort of as restaking or using Bitcoin as a flashable asset, maybe is one way to think about it. It sounds like, from my understanding of Stack so far, is you're not really ever putting your BTC at risk. There's more the auction mechanism, where maybe that's a difference from something like Babylon, where I think the design of it is more around using as a slashable asset. Is that correct? Is that fair to?
Yeah. So I think Babylon I view as quite different, right? Like Babylon is actually taking the approach that they don't want to use a bridge at all, right? Which is interesting, right? Like they're saying that your Bitcoin is actually the most secure if it stays on the L1, which is something I would agree with. But that also means that you're not making BTC programmable. What you're doing is you're locking up BTC in a contract on the L1, and now you're trying to participate in securing some other proof of stake chain, right? And that proof of stake chain, if you want BTC as the asset on that proof of stake chain, you'll still have to figure out some sort of a bridge to get the BTC there, right? So it's more of a infrastructure, like a staking, using Bitcoin in securing other staking networks play, versus making BTC the asset itself programmable and deploy it into smart contracts. But I think so. The systems who are using Babylon, they might figure out bridges, and then they try to bring the Bitcoin asset there as well. So for that, like I think I'm pretty interested in a property of Stacks, which is Stacks can actually read all of the L1 state, which means that we can actually use things like DLCs. Very similar concept to Babylon. Babylon is using a different mechanism for locking up BTC, but we can lock up BTC in a DLC and then link that to smart contracts on the L1, on the L2, right? What that does is it's for a similar market where people who don't want to go over a bridge and they just want to keep their BTC on the L1, they can keep it, but then participate in DeFi by participating in a liquidity pool on the Stacks L2. And I think Stacks, again, like stands out because of the way it's designed, is that it always reads Bitcoin L1 state, and that state is actually available to developers in the L2, right? So they can actually know what the DLC is doing, and actually the contracts can interact with it directly, which is a very sort of like powerful sort of a link. So I think that's how I think about it.
Yeah, that's great. One question I have for you is, it seems like SBTC might be something that's quite unique to Stacks, or at least to the design of it. How should people think about SBTC versus maybe other bridging approaches, or getting your sort of Bitcoin onto an L2? What are the trade-offs? How have you designed SBTC, and what are the advantages of the way you've done it?
Yeah, I would say that SBTC, because Stacks have always been using this design principle to be as close to Bitcoin as possible, as humanly possible, right? So SBTC sort of like benefits from that, and I'll explain why. Like for example, because Stacks reads all of the Bitcoin state, there are some interesting things you could do. Like for example, users could force include their withdraw transactions by using the L1. Think about it. It's an interesting property to have. It's actually a censorship resistance property that you don't need to sort of like rely on whoever is making the block for the L2. You can force include your transaction by using Bitcoin miners at the L1, right? Interesting property, very hard for somebody else to implement it because they're not that tightly integrated with the Bitcoin L1. Similarly, Stacks always forks with Bitcoin, right? So if there's a network fork happening, people don't have to worry about, hey, this thing is going to fork independently of the L1. It never can, right? If whatever Bitcoin is saying, whatever Bitcoin is doing, that is the only thing that's happening on the L2. So again, it makes like, some interesting security properties in case of like, divergent forks and things like that. the path to actually pegging in Bitcoin is also very interesting, that it's more censorship resistant, it's more sort of like transparent and decentralized, because no one can really stop you from pegging in the system, because the L2 is directly reading Bitcoin state, right? So peg in was valid, it comes in. I think the path of taking it out is again where there's some trust assumptions, and those trust assumptions are in some ways unique as well, because you could have a network where the bridge security is maybe separate from consensus. Over here, that's not the case. SBTC is a core part of consensus, right? If something goes wrong with SBTC, the system halts, right? Like the system will stop making forward progress, which basically means that SBTC is treated as a primary asset on Stacks. The security of that is given as much importance as the Stacks consensus itself, right? And again, that's the highest level of importance or security guarantees you can give at the L2 level. So it's basically very, very tightly integrated into the L2 itself, and it derives some of its security properties from there. And then we are open to evolving designs. If through BitVM or some other way we figure out a way to minimize the trust that currently exists in this decentralized validator set, we are already doing R&D work to stay on the cutting edge, that you can incorporate those designs and sort of like make SBTC even better.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Cool. Drake, I saw a few questions in the Q&A. You mind if I pick off one or two?
Have at it. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe Kyle, this is one for you. I'd say this is sort of like an ecosystem approach. We're zooming out to the stacking experience, the UX of stacking. The few questions that we have, is this something that you can only do on certain exchanges? Or talk me through like the steps and the flows of how I do this. I have my STX in my wallet. I have my STX on an exchange. Like, where do you see people being able to stack at? And this is really targeted at someone who's sort of brand new to it and wanted to get started.
Yeah, so we'll start with some of the terms you already use. So you can open up a wallet, create a wallet, whether that be with Leather, Xverse, or many of the other wallets that exist within the ecosystem. You can create a wallet, buy or put in STX, and within those wallets, it's a few clicks of a button to be able to commit the amount of stacks STX that you would like to stack during a two-ish week cycle, where your stacks will be locked up, and then at the end of that cycle they'll be unlocked and you'll yield back Bitcoin, and Bitcoin will return in your wallet. There are also a number of exchanges where you can purchase STX, and a few that you can do this stacking mechanism as well. The easiest, most streamlined process for you would be to set up a wallet, put in some STX, click a few buttons, and you're ready to go. And it's that simple to get started.
The follow-up question I have for you, Kyle, is the 2-week thing. Can I do more of a set it, forget it, or am I clicking buttons every 2 weeks? Like, what's the current experience there, and how might that evolve over time?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's 3 options. So there is set it and forget it. There is the every 2 weeks, and part of the every 2 weeks and set it, forget it, they kind of work in the same, because if you want to maybe increase the amount or decrease the amount, you do have that option to get out of a cycle at any time. And then there is, as I mentioned, liquid stacking that comes via Stacking DAO and Lisa, which is created by the Alex team, that allows you to go in and out at your choosing and not be locked up in those 2-week cycles as well. There are also some other custodians that provide that support furthermore.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Kind of just bumping up close to time here. So wanted to get through 1 or 2 more and then go to some more direct Q&A if there's any additional stuff from the audience. Andy, you described previously telling people, hey, we're Figment, we do everything but Bitcoin. What was the decision like in supporting Stacks? What do you kind of see as how a staking company fits into, the Bitcoin ecosystem?
Yeah, happy to answer this one. Our role as a validator has changed over time, but one thing has always been clear. If you think about, imagine that you're in my role, like how would you steer this business? What you're trying to do is you're trying to increase the value of blocks and move more stuff on chain. That's how I think about our business. So the more blocks we can produce and the higher value they are, the more revenue we make. maybe over time you see our fee will change. In the beginning, we charge higher fees, and then more competition, and staking fees go down. That's fine. But at the end of the day, we only succeed when high quality blocks get made that are high value. And so if you look at the composition of blocks today, you could look at them and say, well, how much of these block rewards are coming from inflation, and how much of the block rewards are coming from transaction fees? And for most blockchains, it's mostly all inflation and hardly any transaction fees. And for us to be successful long term, I think that ratio has to essentially flip or change. And it's sort of it's a different version of the question that everyone always talks about. We talk about Bitcoin. What happens when emissions run out? But for us, a lot of the chains we work on will have permanent inflation, so we could essentially do this forever. But it's a long-winded way of saying, like, the thing that's most exciting for me about stacks and just having an opportunity to start working with Bitcoin is, to me, it's just more high-quality blocks. It's blocks that people are probably willing to pay for, as opposed to just games around new fancy L1 that just inflates their token forever. So maybe that's sort of an inside baseball type answer, but that's why when I look at this, I think really when I look at most long term, we have to make our revenue from fees, not just inflation. And this is a great opportunity to bring out people who actually are willing to pay for blocks and actually create real value.
Yeah, that's great, and totally agree. Having worked with the Stacks team a lot, I think it was easy for us to support them with just how easy they are to work with too. So that's points for that. All right, kind of wrapping up here. 5 years in crypto is a really long time to look forward, so we won't do that. But 1 year from now, what does Bitcoin L2 scene look like? And this is open for anybody here. Give us your hottest take.
I can take a look. So I think in a year we would see at least some mainnet launches, right? So right now we're seeing like a lot of interest, funding rounds, white papers, test nets, but I think we'll see some mainnet launches, which would be healthy. And I think we will sort of like see the initial wave of interest in Bitcoin yield. So people would figure out. Unfortunately, I think there would be some disappointments as well, right? Like some low quality projects where people will end up losing Bitcoin, and there will be some sort of a backlash from it. So no matter how much you warn people, right? Like it almost always happens, right? Like whenever there's a gold rush, all sorts of players like show up for it. But I think at the end of the day, it's like throwing a lot of experiments. Throwing a lot of things at the wall and basically seeing what sticks, right? And I think some of the things will stick, or at least start showing early signs of that within a year. I think a year is too short of a time frame to really know what's going to be there 5 years from now, but we'll start seeing some early signs.
Yeah, I'll also add into that. I think we're going to see the emergence of some virtual machines. So some integrations with the Move ecosystem, whether that be with Aptos or Sui, and then also Solana, the SVM, so the Solana virtual machines, start to have more interest than what we're currently seeing with EVMs as well, which might prompt some of those current networks to maybe shift their perspective of where they're being focused now. EVM, as Muneeb mentioned, the primary of them are, to looking at how to support the additional ecosystems as well. We'll also see the beginnings of that untapped Bitcoin liquidity start to move, and what new use cases could arise from that. As we've used the term experimental experiments, we're going to see a lot of experiments over the next year. We might even see the consolidation of one or two or a handful of networks as well, try to join forces, seeing the opportunity of combining their technical advantages together to create a more advantageous piece of the bigger, broader technical stack that we all need. And something I've talked a lot about as well is when we look at the EVM or the Ethereum ecosystem, we had 7+ years of solid development, a lot of engineering, a lot of applications, a lot of use cases, a lot of lessons learned. When it comes to Bitcoin and its technical stack, there's a lot that we don't know, especially when we again look at that $1.5 trillion of capital that hasn't yet moved. We don't know fully to the extent what technical and infrastructural pieces will need to be put in place to be able to have that move at the rate or the applications and use cases that we want as well. So we're going to be learning on this journey together as well.
Drake, are you going to answer? I mean, you're the stacks bull at Figment. So what do you think? It's May 14th, 2025. Like, what are we looking at?
Yeah, I think you know, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think if we look at some of the proliferation of scaling on Ethereum, I think that frankly, there's room for multiple winners. I think Stacks has a mega head start on a lot of these problems. Building a bridge from scratch, I know a lot of teams are working on doing that. That is not something that happens overnight. So I think there's a huge head start, and frankly, sometimes a rising tide lifts all boats. The more people interacting with Bitcoin, the more liquid Bitcoin there is transferring through protocols. Frankly, it makes a lot more things possible. It makes DeFi quicker, faster, funding rates more attractive, NFT protocols, apps, games, all this stuff. You know, sometimes the more the better. That's what I'd say. So exciting generally. Have a couple minutes left. Any additional questions from anybody in the audience?
Can you see the Q&A, Drake? The little button at the bottom.
Yes, I just popped it up here.
I can summarize one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one is talking about what happens when BTC is bridged to other chains. So let's say Solana gets BTC. We talked earlier about SBTC and some of the properties, so I think we answered this question a little bit. But you know, how does the Stacks use case change when we get good enough bridges so BTC can exist on something like a Solana?
Yeah, I think I would go back to that Stacks is specifically designed to be as close to Bitcoin as possible. And that's not the design goals of Solana, right? Like they're building a different system. I'll just give one example of like gas fees, right? Like there's a proposal where Bitcoin or SBTC can be used as gas fees on Stacks. And I think from a UX perspective, like these things are very important. Like if the main goal is to make BTC the primary asset, and BTC is the thing that people are using, an ecosystem like Stacks would be willing to have users pay gas fees in BTC. Probably not true for an Ethereum or Solana, right? So it's basically where you have the most native integration. Same thing with talking about SBTC's core part of consensus. Even if there is a Bitcoin asset, like, you know, take WBTC, for example, on Ethereum. If something goes wrong with WBTC smart contract, the rest of the Ethereum ecosystem doesn't care. Like it will just continue to function. It's a sideshow for them. Whereas SBTC is core part of consensus. So the amount of sort of like, you know, dependence or security or audits or the entire economy sort of like revolving around the asset is very different from a Stacks L2 versus an independent L1.
Awesome. Last question on here. When are we expecting Nakamoto upgrade to go live? Can you describe the cause for the delay?
Yes. So I think it's basically the upgrade was divided into two parts. The part one actually went live on time, and even before that, you know, the team was hitting every single milestone for test nets and so on. And part of the reason it was designed in two parts was to test out certain things on the live mainnet, right? So part one went live, and now you can actually test out all these different signers, how they're performing, and so on. And the core devs had identified this component, like which basically makes the signers more reliable and how easily they can converge on signatures and so on. They had it planned for later in the year, right? So let's call it the more advanced system, and then there was the more basic system that can go live with Nakamoto. And some of the testing on the mainnet was showing that you might need the advanced system sooner than you think, right? So that's sort of like the only thing there. And it's a pretty tractable problem, like in the sense that it's code new. So Stacks Nakamoto was code complete and going through testing to be launched, right? All the code is written. So this is a new component where you need to write more code, which is estimated to be around 8 weeks of work. and it's public and it's on GitHub. So anyone can go take a look at, what portion of that is already done. Are they hitting the estimates week over week? And then once you hit code complete, then you're back to where you were, right? Now you're back to code complete, and now you just need to do testing and go live, right? So I think it's a very sort of like I know like for people, like these things could be ambiguous, like, hey, why was there a delay? Will there be more delays or not? But I think given how transparent this ecosystem is, it's actually a pretty straightforward thing in a way, that there's this piece of code which was going to be written later in the year. Devs realize that it should be done now, and you can just go and track like how progress on that is going.
Yeah, totally agree. I think y'all have been super transparent about everything. All this is publicly available. And hey, ultimately, all good things are worth waiting for. Panelists, thank you all so much for joining us today. I think we can about wrap it up there, and the audience as well. Have a great day,
Awesome.
everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
And really excited to see Figment, supporting Nakamoto launch. I think that's going to be amazing.
We're super excited as well.
Looking forward.
Thanks, y'all.
All right. Take care.